And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Aviation Weather Outlook on this Sunday, February 2nd, 2025. And as we head into the first full week of February, the weather pattern is such that we're going to have high pressure largely anchored over northwest Canada, over this region of the Yukon, Northwest Territory, British Columbia, now through perhaps as long as Valentine's Day, so that's like another week and a half. Meanwhile, the main storm track still coming up out of the North Pacific into the Bering and maybe even a little bit up toward the Alaska Peninsula, but there's no signs of any really powerful storms on the immediate horizon in the week ahead. But nevertheless, we have the high here, the storm track coming up like this, a warmer south to north flow of air coming up along the west coast, so we expect above normal temperatures with some occasional light to moderate precipitation. And then here in the Panhandle, cold and drier weather that will also prevail in through much of the mainland, especially south and eastern areas. Though the cold is going to begin to moderate. In other words, we're not going to have the bitter cold we've had here past couple of mornings back into late last week. That's going to begin to let up the sub-zero, the really cold sub-zero temperatures letting up there, and even the cold. Instead of single digits and teens, we may start to see temperatures back up near 30 in the Panhandle here by the time we get into midweek. So temperatures at least will be moderating. But as I said, out to the west is where we find the IFR conditions over the Bering, especially eastern Bering from St. Lawrence down through St. Matthew, the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians with a feed of moisture that's coming northward and will eventually get areas of the west coast. But south central into the interior here for early in the week with high pressure. We got actually two high pressure systems. The Arctic, cold high pressure over northwest Canada, and then an unusually warm ridge of high pressure in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. And I'll be able to point that out better here shortly on the upper wind map. So we find that IFR conditions with some precipitation, some snow, and then further south it's rain because temperatures along the west coast have generally going to be around and above, a bit above freezing. And by the time we get into Tuesday, there'll be a system that pushes inland. There will be wind and snow along areas of the Bering Strait, Chukchi Sea coast. That'll require advisories or even some brief warnings for blowing, drifting snow. But again, some of that moisture makes it inland with some lower cloud cover ceilings into the areas of the central interior, but it's not going to be a very wet system. And Tuesday afternoon, we find IFR conditions along the west coast from just southwest of Utqiagvik, Wainwright, down through Point Hope, along the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, the YK Deltas, and all the way down to the eastern Aleutians. And some of that spreading eastward into the interior, but not expected to be a big snowmaker. Any snow that should make it inland would be fairly light, at least relatively speaking. But notice, south central, southeast Alaska here, this region will generally enjoy VFR conditions for the next several days, especially early in the week. So past conditions on Monday, Anaktuvik Pass VFR could become MVFR briefly. Same thing, Adigan Pass VFR maybe becoming MVFR in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill down there in the west arm of the Alaska Range, VFR conditions. And as we round up through the central Alaska Range, VFR at Rainy, Windy, and Isabel passes. As we get a little further east, though, there could be some MVFR conditions on Monday, especially midday and in the afternoon as you fly up there toward the north entrance and points further north. And then down across the Copper River Basin, aside from some moisture that could be trapped in some low-level inversions, Tanita Pass is looking VFR, as will Portage Pass be VFR. And then the far northern Panhandle, look for Chilkoot and White there to be VFR in the morning, becoming MVFR. And here are the freezing levels at the surface. Notice for Monday morning early, we have freezing line running up along the west-southwest coast. That could actually even temperatures near freezing, even up there near Nome, Savunga. But that's the case where the milder air is out here over the Bering with a southerly flow. Meanwhile, we have that colder north-northeasterly outflow, offshore flow because of the high, the Arctic high centered here. And then here's an indication of that mid and upper level ridge. As you go up, there's a very strong temperature inversion, and temperatures aloft because of the compressional warming. If you remember your meteorology from flying. There was an old book, I'm trying to remember, I think it was called Flight Weather. So you have this compressional warming with a mid and upper level high. So as you go up, you find actually warmer temperatures and temperatures. As such, freezing levels at or above 4,000 and 6,000 feet over the southwest mainland, western arm of the Alaska Range into the North Pacific. And the icing potential where there are clouds and clouds that are bearing precipitation. Here we have that southerly flow of moisture coming up out of the North Pacific, so there could be a little moderate icing near the eastern Aleutians and as you go north up through the Pribilofs, but pretty isolated above 4,000 and 6,000 feet there. And then in the far north, we could find some areas of isolated moderate icing above 3,000 feet, but nothing widespread like we saw here with a couple of the past storm systems. Though I would expect there'll be a better chance of some icing as we move into Tuesday, Wednesday, as some of that moisture comes inland. So most impressive about this particular graphic here for the jet stream, 30,000 foot level, 300 millibars. Look at this big high pressure ridge. This is the warm upper level high pressure ridge. Circulation around it, southerly flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere across the Bering, especially the eastern half. And then notice the northeasterly flow across northwest Canada and the Panhandle. This is where the surface cold Arctic high pressure resides. This is where the warmer mid and upper level high is, but there's also a surface reflection there. Now, as we bring it down to 9,000 feet or 700 millibars, we continue to see in the mid-levels of the atmosphere this northeasterly flow over northwest Canada across the Panhandle with winds much stronger, in excess of 50, 60 knots offshore of the Panhandle. And then here on the backside, return flow from the high center. This is a strong mid-level high. Southerly and southwesterly flow all across the Bering with some areas of enhanced flow of 50 to as high as 65 knots here from areas of the Bering Strait back toward the Gulf of Anadyr and into the western side there of the Bering. Then at 3,000 feet, where we have the surface Arctic high, not a lot of wind in this area. But the outflow winds, the low-level pressure gradient draining the cold air from higher elevations to lower elevations. We do have some stronger outflow winds, especially there. Dixon entrance, 40, 50 knots. And then as we get over here, and taking a look, there's a stream of moisture, or I should say a southerly milder flow of air with some moisture coming up out of the North Pacific across the eastern Aleutians and then up along the southwest coast. And then we have another segment coming in off the western Bering along the eastern Russian coast up through the Bering Strait, and then some stronger winds on the order of 45 to 60 knots up there along the northwest Arctic coast, north slope, and up toward Utqiagvik. So when we're looking at the threat of turbulence on Monday, first of all, with the cold outflow, areas of the Panhandle, some of the inner channels, and then the gaps along the outer coast, there could be moderate turbulence, surface to 6,000 feet. In the west, what I just showed you, those stronger winds, there could be some moderate turbulence and blowing, drifting snow here in areas of the northwest and west coast, especially from Utqiagvik and down here through the Lisburn Peninsula around Point Hope in the western and northern Seward Peninsulas. And then we find also back towards St. Lawrence, an area of southerly flow enhanced a bit there could create some turbulence also in through the eastern Aleutians on Monday from the surface to 3,000 feet.